My name is Laura Benoit, and I'm 34 years old. 2 weeks after my divorce, I was alone in the house I paid for, feeding my 8-month-old daughter at 2 in the morning when my mother called. She didn't ask how I was. She said, "Get the rooms ready. Your sister and I are moving in this weekend." When I told her this was my home and I needed my space, she snapped, "Then get out of that mansion." For months, she had been telling our entire family that I'd lost everything in the divorce. She believed it. She wanted my sister to have my house. What she didn't know was that only one name was ever on the deed, and by Sunday, everyone would learn whose. That was the morning everything began to turn. Let me take you back, because the phone call wasn't the beginning of anything. It was only the first time I let myself hear it clearly. I was on the floor of the nursery when the screen lit up with the word, "Mom." The bottle was still warm in my hand, and Avery's fingers were curled around it, and the only light in the whole house came from the fixture over the hallway. I remember the reflex before I remember the fear. Answer on the first ring. Don't let it go to 2. Don't make her wait, because a mother who waits is a mother who is already annoyed with you before you've said a word. I'd carried that reflex for 34 years, and it moved my thumb before my brain caught up. She didn't say hello. She never really did. "Get the rooms ready. Your sister and I are moving in this weekend. There are 4 bedrooms in my house." She talked about them the way a manager talks about a schedule, like the assignments were already made and she was just informing the staff. And she said something that I didn't understand at first. She said, "We've already talked about it." I sat there in the dark trying to work out who "we" was, and when that conversation had happened, and why the person whose house it was hadn't been part of it. "Mom," I said, and I kept my voice low so I wouldn't wake the baby. "This is my house. I need my space." I wasn't trying to fight. I'd signed papers ending a marriage 14 days earlier. I had a newborn who woke 3 times a night, a practice to run in the morning, and the kind of exhaustion that lives behind your eyes and doesn't leave when you sleep. All I wanted was to be still for a minute in a room that was mine. There was a pause, and in that pause I could hear her deciding not to negotiate. "Your sister needs it more than you do," she said. "You've always known how to manage. Chelsea's in a hard spot." "I'm in a hard spot," I said. "I just got divorced." "You'll be fine. You're always fine." "Mom, I'm asking you to hear me. I need my space right now." "Then get out of that mansion," she said. And she hung up. Avery startled at the sound of her grandmother's voice coming sharp through the speaker, her eyes going wide for a second, before she found the bottle again and settled. I didn't cry. I want you to know that, because it matters to the rest of this. I set the phone down on my knee, and I looked at the clock on the kitchen wall through the doorway, and it read 2:19, and I noticed something strange about myself. For the first time in my whole life, I hadn't been the one apologizing first. I'd asked for something and I hadn't taken it back. That felt more dangerous than the demand did because I knew what my family did to people who stopped apologizing. I sat in the dark long after Avery fell asleep, and I kept turning the call over. It wasn't the words. My mother had said sharp things my whole life. Sharp was her ordinary weather. It was the certainty in her. She hadn't sounded like a woman asking a favor. She'd sounded like a woman confirming a delivery, checking a box on a plan that was already in motion somewhere I couldn't see. My phone buzzed on my knee. A text, from a cousin's number I barely used. I didn't open it. I looked at the little gray notification, and I felt the first cold thread of understanding pull tight in my chest. If someone was texting me at 2 in the morning, then somebody out there already knew something I didn't. I set the phone face down and went to check the front door, and I found it locked. Exactly the way I'd left it. And I checked it anyway, because that's what your hands do when your mind knows a storm is coming and can't yet see it. I need you to understand who I was to my family, because the house was never really about the house. Growing up, I was the one who didn't need anything. That was the story, and a story like that stops being a description and becomes a job. My sister Chelsea is 2 years older, And she was the one things happened to, the one who needed rides and rescues and second chances handed over without questions. I was the one who figured it out. Bad grade, I fixed it myself. Flat tire in the school parking lot, I learned to change it. No money for the class trip. I found a weekend job bagging groceries and paid my own way. Somewhere in there, capable, curdled into, doesn't need us, and doesn't need us, hardened into, don't waste worry on her. I became furniture that could carry weight. My father understood it better than my mother ever did, but he never fought it, and I've had to make a slow peace with that. Wayne Benoit was a gentle man, a quiet man, and when he was alive he'd catch my eye across a room whenever my mother handed Chelsea another lifeline, and he'd give me this small, sorry look, like an apology he couldn't afford to say out loud. He died in 2023. After that, my mother leaned all the way into the story with no one left to soften it. "You've always landed on your feet, Laura," she'd say, and she'd say it like a compliment, like a medal. What she meant was simpler and colder than a compliment. What she meant was, you don't get to fall. There's a portrait on her mantle, one of those posed studio ones with the fake autumn background. If you look closely, I'm standing half a step out of the frame on the right, not quite inside it. That photograph told the truth about my place in the family before I had the words for it. And here's the thing about being the strong one that no one warns you about. If you're the one who never needs anything, then you're also the one who can always give. Over the years, when the family caught fire, I was the water they reached for. 3 times I paid, and not once did anyone ask whether I was the one drowning. The first time, my mother's roof started leaking during a wet spring and she couldn't cover the repair. I paid for it, $4,000, quietly, and she thanked me by not mentioning it again. The second time, there was a hospital bill after her knee surgery, and I covered that too. And when a relative praised her for how well she'd handled the recovery, she accepted it like she'd handled the bill as well. The third time is the one that still sits in my chest, because that was the $18,000. Chelsea had a debt about to become a legal problem, and my mother came to me alone, in her kitchen, with the good coffee out, and she said, "Your sister's in trouble, and you're the only one who can fix it without making a scene." She always framed my money as discretion, like paying was a way of keeping the peace. I gave her the $18,000. And then, 4 months later, at a family dinner, I heard my mother tell the whole table how proud she was that Chelsea had pulled herself together and cleared that debt on her own. $18,000 of my money, and my mother handed the credit to my sister across the mashed potatoes. And then she looked at me, and she smiled, and the smile was a dare. Say something. Go on. Be the one who ruins dinner over money. I didn't say anything. I want to be honest about that, because I wasn't a hero in my own story for a long time. I sat there and let it happen, because the cost of speaking always felt higher than the cost of swallowing. That's the whole trap. When you're the strong one, your silence gets called strength, and your strength gets treated as consent. I keep a small notebook where I used to log what I spent. 3 lines, underlined in pencil, in my own handwriting. 4,000. The hospital bill, 18,000. During the divorce, I found that notebook in a box, and I read those 3 lines, and I finally let myself feel how long I'd been carrying the family's water while dying of thirst. Because that's the part that broke something loose in me. In 8 months of my marriage coming apart, in 8 months of holding a newborn and a mortgage and my own grief, not one person in my family asked me how I was. Not one. My call log was full of my mother and my sister, and every single call was about a thing they wanted. Not one of them said, "Are you okay, Laura?" I scrolled the list one night just to be sure I wasn't being unfair to them. I wasn't. If you've ever been the one everyone leaned on but no one ever checked on, you already know this ache. Stay with me. This one's for you. The phone rang while I was thinking exactly that, and the name on the screen surprised me. Aunt Ruth, my father's younger sister, and the one person in the family who had never once put her hand out to me. I let it ring twice, an act of quiet rebellion I didn't even notice I was performing, and then I answered. I didn't know yet that Ruth was about to tell me why my mother had sounded so certain on the phone, or that her call was the loose thread that would unravel the whole thing. I have to tell you about the house, because the house is the fact everyone got wrong on purpose. I bought it, not we. I did. I opened my dental practice, Cedar Hollow Dental and Aesthetics, in 2016, in a strip of medical offices off the county road, and I built it up one chair and one patient at a time. First, it was just me and a front desk girl, and a lot of late nights doing my own billing. Then it was 2 operatories. Then it was cosmetic work, veneers and whitening, and the kind of procedures that let a practice turn a corner. By the time the house on Birchwood Lane came up for sale, I had something my family had never expected me to build, which was money that was mine and a name the bank trusted. I put down $310,000. I signed the loan, and the loan was in my name only. That last part wasn't pride. It was arithmetic. My husband, Scott, had credit problems he'd never fully cleaned up, old debts and a bankruptcy from his 20s, and when we sat across from the loan officer and applied together, the answer was no. The officer was kind about it, but she was clear. "We can do this on your income and your credit alone," she told me, sliding the paper across. "His name will only slow it down." So the mortgage was mine. The deed was mine. Every payment, every property tax bill, the new roof I put on last spring after a windstorm, all of it came out of the account with my name on it and no one else's. Scott and I didn't end in some cinematic way. There was no other person, no screaming that went on for years. We simply wore through. We'd married young and we'd grown in different directions, and when Avery came, the distance between us stopped being something we could pretend around. When it ended, the divorce was quiet, because there was almost nothing that was actually shared. He signed without a fight. I remember the day he signed. We met at a coffee shop of all places, because neither of us wanted to do it in a lawyer's conference room. He read the settlement, and he got to the part about the house, and he looked up at me. "It was never mine to argue over," he said. "You know that. I knew it the day the bank turned me down." He signed his name, and the pen started to run dry halfway through his last name, so the letters trailed off pale, and he shook it and finished. He took his car and a modest cash payment we'd agreed on, and that was it. The folded settlement went into a blue folder in my desk drawer, so when my mother told the family that I'd lost everything in the divorce, it wasn't a mistake. That's the part that took me longest to accept, because a mistake would have been forgivable, but there was nothing to misunderstand. The house was mine before the marriage ended and mine after. My mother didn't get it wrong. She built it wrong on purpose, brick by careful brick, because a woman who lost everything is a woman you can move out of her own home without anyone blinking. A woman who owns her house free and clear is not. I sat at my kitchen table with the phone still warm from Ruth's call, and I opened the desk drawer and the deed was right there where it always was. And next to it was an envelope in my father's handwriting that I still hadn't opened. His last letter to me. I'd carried it from my old apartment to this house without ever breaking the seal, and I still couldn't do it. I closed the drawer and went back to the phone, because Ruth was still talking. And what she said next changed the shape of the whole week. "You should hear what your mother's been telling everyone," Ruth said. I asked her what she meant, and she was quiet for a moment. The way people go quiet before they hand you something heavy. "She's been saying the divorce cleaned you out," Ruth said. "That you're drowning. That you all but begged her to take the house off your hands because you can't manage it alone with the baby." She paused. "She told them you asked her to take it, Laura. She said you couldn't handle the place on your own." I could hear a kettle somewhere behind her voice, small and domestic, and it grounded the conversation in something real. Ruth wasn't calling to stir the pot for her own gain. She'd sat inside this family her whole life and watched them treat me like a spare tire, and she'd finally reached the edge of what she could stand to witness. "There's a group chat you're not in," she said. And then, quieter. I'm going to send you some of it. I don't feel right about it. But you need to see this before the weekend. The screenshots came through a minute later, blurry, taken fast, a thumb clipping the corner of one of them. But I could read enough. My whole extended family, sorting out my house like it was an estate sale after a funeral. Chelsea takes the master. Laura will come around. She always does. Someone asking which weekend worked best for the truck. An aunt volunteering her husband to help carry the heavy furniture. And at the bottom, my mother, in a line that dropped my stomach through the floor. By Sunday it'll be done. They weren't asking me. They were managing me. They had decided in advance that my no was a formality, a tantrum I'd get over the way I'd gotten over everything else, because that was the story they'd all agreed to believe about me. Laura complains, and then Laura folds. Laura is the water. I set the phone face down on the table, and I sat very still for a while. And then I did something I hadn't done in 34 years. I stopped waiting to be asked, and I started getting ready. The first thing I did was go looking for a voicemail. I'd saved it months earlier without fully knowing why. At the time, it had just felt like a bad message on a bad day. One of those things you keep because deleting it feels like pretending it didn't happen. I found it in my saved folder and I played it on the kitchen speaker, in the dark, and this time I heard every word for what it was. "You owe this family, Laura," my mother's voice said, smooth and unhurried. "Don't make me remind everyone how much." She'd left it during a stretch when I'd said no to something small, and back then I'd read it as her being dramatic. Now I heard the machinery in it. The debt she thought I owed. The threat to collect it in public. The word everyone, like the family, was a courtroom she could convene whenever she wanted me to fold. Avery looked up from her playmat toward the sound of her grandmother's voice, tilting her head, and I turned it off before it could finish, because I didn't want that voice in the air near my daughter. Then I opened my laptop and typed 3 words into the search bar. Ring doorbell setup. I want to be clear about what I was and wasn't doing, because it's the difference between the woman I became and the woman my mother thought she was dealing with. I wasn't building a case to destroy anyone. I wasn't planning revenge. I was building the truth, in order, so that when the moment came, I wouldn't have to raise my voice to be believed. I had spent my whole life being talked over. This time, I wanted the facts to do the talking. I found a manila folder in my office and I wrote 1 word on the label in black marker. House. Into it went everything, 1 document at a time. The deed, with my name and only my name on the ownership line. The divorce settlement with Scott's dried-out signature. Printouts of the group chat Ruth had sent, time-stamped. And the bank records from the 3 times I'd bailed the family out, including a statement showing the $18,000 moving from my account, on a date that sat 4 months before the dinner where my mother had praised Chelsea for paying it herself. I laid it all out on the kitchen table like I was setting a table for a dinner none of them would ever be invited to. Then I made a second copy of the whole thing, and I put it in a different folder, and I told myself I didn't know who it was for yet. That wasn't quite true. Some part of me already knew there'd be a morning when I'd want the truth in 2 places, so that no one could reach across and take the only copy. On Saturday, I called a locksmith. He came at 9 and worked until noon, an older man with a steady manner, and he changed every exterior lock in the house. While he worked on the front door, he glanced at me, and maybe he read something in my face, because he said, "New start?" And I said, "Something like that." And he nodded like he'd done a lot of doors for a lot of new starts. When he finished, he handed me a small envelope of new keys and said, "Nobody's getting in with an old one. You're the only one who opens this house now." He didn't know how much those words would mean to me by Sunday. After he left, I opened 4 boxes I'd ordered, 4 small cameras in blue cardboard, and I mounted them myself, 1 at a time, on a stepladder, with a little drill I'd bought years ago and rarely used. 1 at the front gate, 1 over the front door, 1 on the garage, 1 in the back. It took most of the afternoon, and I noticed my hands weren't shaking. They were steady, and that steadiness told me something about myself I'd let the family make me forget. When the last camera came online, a tiny green light blinked and my phone buzzed. Motion detected. Front gate. I opened the feed, and there was no one there that I could see, only the long shadows of early evening reaching across the driveway. But something had been close enough, recently enough, that the system had already learned the shape of the approach. Someone had been walking my property. I stood in my own front hall with the hair rising on my arms. That night, Chelsea texted me. Not a call. Not an apology. Not, "Hey, can we talk about this?" Just a question, typed the way you'd ask a hotel for the Wi-Fi password. "What's the new code? Movers come Sunday at 9. I watched the 3 dots appear and vanish, several times before the message finally landed, like even she could feel how strange it was to send. Movers. Sunday. 9. She wasn't asking whether she could come. She was confirming the arrival time for a house she'd already decided was hers, and she was asking me, the current owner, to please hand over the keys to my own front door. I didn't answer. I saved the message to the house folder and I made my decision. I would not argue with any of them over the phone or by text. Every word I typed would be a word they could twist. I was going to let them arrive, in person, in daylight, where the truth couldn't be edited. Because by then I understood what this was really about, and it wasn't family, and it wasn't love, and it wasn't even about me. It was about a mortgage my sister couldn't pay. I'd learned it in pieces, the way you learn the worst things. Chelsea and Kyle were 3 payments behind on their own house, $86,000 underwater by the time you counted the missed payments, the penalties, and the second loan they'd taken against it. A couple of weeks earlier, I'd stopped by my mother's to drop off a birthday card, and there'd been an envelope on her kitchen counter with the kind of bold black letters that make your throat close. Notice of default. It had Chelsea's name on it, forwarded to our mother's address, which told me the two of them were already handling it together, already deciding things at that kitchen table with the good coffee out. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what it meant. That was the moment the whole thing snapped into focus. My mother hadn't come to me for the $18,000 this time. She'd learned that lesson. Borrowing the water meant asking, and asking meant I might say no, and a no from me was inconvenient. So this time she wasn't going to borrow the well, she was going to take it. Move Chelsea into my paid-for house, move me down to the couch or out the door, and solve my sister's problem by erasing my home. In the group chat, they'd already divided my rooms. Master bedroom for Chelsea and Kyle. My office turned into storage for their things. And then the line that made me stand up in the middle of Avery's nursery and just breathe for a minute. "Put the baby's stuff in the garage for now, we'll sort it later." The baby's stuff. My daughter, 8 months old, reduced to a category of items to be relocated to the garage while the adults settled who got the good bedroom. I stood among Avery's things, the little sock that had lost its match, the mobile of paper moons turning slightly in the draft from the vent, and something in me went very quiet and very clear, like the surface of water after the wind stops. Then a new message came, and this one wasn't in the group chat. It was a private text from an aunt I'd always liked, one of the ones who'd stayed neutral my whole life. "Honey," it read, "just make it easy on everyone, okay? Your mom's under a lot of stress. You don't want to be the reason this family splits." She wasn't cruel. She thought she was helping. That was almost worse. My mother had gotten to her first, and now even the kind ones were arriving with a script that made me the villain before I'd done anything but own my house. Ruth sent me one more thing before Sunday. A message my mother had blasted to the family, and it was pure strategy. If she locks that door, she's turning her back on all of us. She was building a jury in advance, and she was doing it well. Anyone who took my side was betraying the family. My boundary wasn't a boundary. It was an assault. And she wanted every one of them to arrive already believing it, so that when they saw my locked door, they'd see proof. Ruth added a line of her own, just for me. I'm not part of this, Laura. 6 words. The first time in my adult life, a member of my family had stepped out of my mother's story instead of into it. I read it 3 times, and then I saved it too, because I was learning that the people who stand beside you quietly are worth keeping a record of, the same as the people who come for you. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I sat by Avery's crib and listened to her breathe, that fast, soft rhythm babies have, and I let myself feel the weight of what the next morning would cost. I opened the desk drawer one more time, the deed, the house folder, and the envelope with my father's handwriting on it, my name written in his careful fountain pen letters, gone a little yellow at the edges. Laura. I held it in both hands, and I still couldn't open it. I told myself it was because I needed to hold myself together for the morning, that whatever was inside would take something out of me that I couldn't spare yet. Maybe that was true. Maybe I was just afraid. I set it back in the drawer, next to the soft glow of the moon-shaped nightlight, and I promised it I'd come back. Then I went through the house one last time. I checked the 4 cameras on my phone, 4 little black squares waiting to wake. I charged everything, laid my phone on the table by the front door where I could reach it, and set the house folder beside it, closed, ready. And I made a promise to myself that I think saved me from becoming someone I wouldn't have wanted to be. I would not shout in the morning. I would not fight them at the threshold like a woman defending a fort. I would let them come, and I would set the truth down where everyone could see it, and I would let it do the work that shouting never does. Around 11, my phone buzzed one last time. An automated confirmation, forwarded from the moving company to Chelsea and copied, by accident or by arrogance, to the family thread Ruth kept feeding me. Booking confirmed. Sunday, 9 a.m. The storm had a time now, and a truck, and a plan, and none of them knew that the woman they were coming to move had spent the week getting ready. Before I tell you what happened when that truck pulled up, tell me in the comments. Would you have opened the door, or would you have let the cameras do the talking? Sunday came in gray and still, with a thin light that made everything look honest, like the morning itself had decided not to hide anything. At 9 o'clock, the truck arrived. I heard it before I saw it. That low diesel grumble rolling up Birchwood Lane, and then the rattle of the cargo door going up like a curtain rising on a show I'd never agreed to be in. I watched the first minute on my phone, from the gate camera, and then I walked to the front window and watched it with my own eyes. My mother got out of the lead car like she was arriving at a party. She had dressed up. That detail has never left me. She wore her good coat, the camel one she saved for occasions, as if taking her daughter's house were something worth looking nice for. Chelsea climbed out after her, then Kyle, and behind them a second car spilled out about 4 relatives, an aunt, a cousin, someone's husband in work gloves, all of them there to carry my sister's furniture into my home. Across the low fence, my neighbors Nancy and Ray Alcott had come out onto their porch. Nancy stood holding a coffee mug in both hands, the way you hold something warm when you're settling in to watch. Ray leaned in the doorway behind her. They weren't nosy people, the Alcotts. They'd lived next to me for 3 years and never once pried. But a moving truck at 9 on a Sunday morning has a way of telling a whole street to pay attention. My mother walked up my front path like she'd built it, and Chelsea went to the door with a key in her hand. Her old key. She fit it into the new lock and turned, and it didn't move. She frowned, jiggled it, tried again, put her shoulder into it. Tried a 3rd time. And I watched the first hairline crack run through the certainty they'd all arrived carrying. "The lock's broken," Chelsea called back over her shoulder. "It's not broken," my mother said, and there was something in how fast she said it that told me she already understood and didn't want to. I opened the door then, with Avery on my hip, and I stood in the doorway. I did not step out. That was on purpose. I stayed inside the frame of my own house, one hand on the door, my daughter warm against my side, and I let them all look at me standing exactly where I belonged. "Laura," my mother said, and she pitched her voice loud enough to carry to the relatives and across the fence to the Alcotts, because she'd always known how to play to a crowd. "Open this door properly and stop this. Don't embarrass this family in front of everyone." "I'm not embarrassing anyone," I said. My voice came out even, quieter than hers, which forced people to lean in to hear it. "I'm standing in my own house. Your house." She laughed, one short note, and turned to the aunt beside her as if to share the joke. "You hear that? Her house." "It is my house, Mom. It's a family house," she said, sharpening. "And your sister needs it, and you're going to do the right thing, because that's who you are. You're the one who does the right thing." She was reaching for the old lever, the strong one, the one who gives, the one who folds. I watched her reach for it, and I felt it not catch, for the first time in my life. "Chelsea," I said, looking past my mother to my sister, who wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "Did you order that truck before or after you texted me for the door code?" Chelsea's jaw tightened. She didn't answer, which was an answer. My mother stepped in front of her, cutting the sight line, taking back the stage. And then she made the mistake that ended it. She threw out her arm toward the house, toward the relatives, and she said the thing she was so sure of that she offered it up like a trump card. "Tell her," my mother said to the family. "Tell her whose house this really is." She meant it as a weapon. She believed the answer was already settled, that every person standing in my driveway had swallowed the story she'd been feeding them for weeks, and that the combined weight of all of them would finally move me aside. She handed me, out loud, in front of witnesses, the exact question I'd spent the whole week preparing to answer. I reached back to the little table by the door and picked up the deed. I walked it out to the edge of the porch, and I held it out. Not to my mother, and not to Chelsea, but to Ray Alcott, the most neutral person in the yard. "Ray," I said, "would you read the name on this?" Out loud, so everyone hears at once, and I don't have to say it myself. He looked at me, then at my mother, then down at the paper. His hands weren't quite steady because no one enjoys being handed a stranger's storm and asked to hold it. But he found the ownership line, and he cleared his throat, and he read it. "Laura Benoit," he said. "Sole owner." 2 words dropped into that driveway like stones into still water. Sole owner. One of the relatives, the cousin in the work gloves, took half a step back, the way you do when the floor you're standing on turns out to belong to someone else. The aunt who'd texted me looked at my mother, and something moved across her face. Nobody spoke for a moment. The only sound was the idling truck. My mother recovered fast. She always did. "That's a mistake," she said. "She lost the house in the divorce. Everyone knows that. Her husband took it." "Her husband," I said, "was never on the loan. The bank turned him down in 2016. He signed everything over the day we divorced, because there was nothing to sign over. It was already mine." "You're lying," my mother said. But her voice had thinned, and she was still holding on to the story even as it came apart in her hands, because it was the only thing she'd brought with her. She hadn't brought a working key, or a true claim, or a single document. She'd brought a story, and stories don't turn locks and they don't move ownership lines. So I set down the second thing. I'd left my phone by the gate speaker, wired to the little outdoor unit, and with one tap I played the voicemail. My mother's own voice came out into the still yard, clear and smooth and certain, the same voice she used at dinner tables and on the phone at 2 a.m. "You owe this family, Laura. Don't make me remind everyone how much." I didn't say a word over it. I need you to understand that, because it's the whole point. I didn't accuse her. I didn't explain what it meant. I didn't narrate. I just pressed play and let her introduce herself to the crowd in her own voice, on her own terms, with her own words. It is a strange thing to watch a person hear themselves from the outside. My mother's face changed as her voice moved through the air toward the people she'd spent weeks convincing. She heard the threat in it, the ownership, the way she'd tried to turn family into a debt she could call in whenever it suited her. The aunt in the driveway put her hand over her mouth. Chelsea turned away and stared at the truck like it might tell her what to do. And Kyle, who had never once had a spine when it counted, put his hand on Chelsea's arm and started steering her back toward the car. "Chelsea," my mother said, not turning around, her eyes still on me. "Stay where you are." But Chelsea didn't. She let Kyle move her. And that small defection, my sister choosing the car over my mother's command, told the whole driveway something that no document could. The plan had a crack in its center, and the center was pulling away. I didn't press it further. I didn't play a third clip, though I had more in the folder. The bank statement, the group chat, the 18,000. Every receipt only gets used when it changes the balance, and the balance had already changed. Using more would have turned truth into cruelty, and I didn't come out to my own porch to be cruel. I came out to be finished. My mother stood on the path, and for the first time in my life, she had nothing to say. Not a comeback, not a correction, not a command. The woman who'd always had the last word stood in front of my house in her good coat, with her mouth slightly open, and nothing came. I looked at the relatives, and I looked at Nancy and Ray, and I said the only thing I had planned to say, and I said it quietly, so they'd have to keep it. "I was never the one who lost everything," I said. "You just needed me to be, so this would be easier." Then I thanked Ray, and I took the deed gently back from his hands, and I stepped inside, and I closed the door, and I turned the new lock. The click was small. In the quiet of that gray morning, with a truck idling and a family frozen on the path, it was the loudest thing I had ever done. I'd like to tell you that winning felt like winning. It didn't. It felt like something breaking that couldn't be mended, and knowing you were right to break it doesn't stop the sound of it. Through the narrow glass beside the door, I watched them leave. The relatives peeled off first, quick and quiet, the way people move away from something they don't want to be associated with later. The cousin in the work gloves didn't even look back. Kyle got Chelsea into the car and pulled out fast, and the truck I hadn't ordered and hadn't wanted, rolled back down Birchwood Lane with its cargo door still up and its bed empty, having carried nothing in and nothing out. My mother was the last to go. She stood on the path a long moment, looking at the house like she was still waiting for me to open the door and apologize and make it all easy again. When I didn't, she walked to her car alone. Avery had fallen asleep against my shoulder somewhere in the middle of it, the way babies do, trusting the world to be handled by the person holding them. I stood in my front hall and held my daughter and breathed, and the house was very quiet, and it was mine. The cost came due over the following weeks, and it was real, and no one was spared, least of all the people who'd started it. Chelsea lost her house anyway. The plan to take mine had been the only plan she had, and when it collapsed on my porch on that gray Sunday, there was nothing underneath it to catch her. The default went through. She and Kyle moved into a rental across town, a smaller place with a shared driveway, and I heard about it secondhand, because by then she wasn't speaking to me. I found out that even the 18,000 I'd given years ago hadn't gone where I thought. Some of it had covered a car she'd since traded in. Water poured into sand. The family split quietly, the way families actually do. There was no dramatic falling out at a holiday table, no speech, no line drawn in front of everyone. It was just that the footage from my gate camera made its way through the family the way things do now, forwarded and re-forwarded, and people watched my mother turn to a driveway and demand, "Tell her whose house this really is," and then heard her own voicemail answer the question in her own voice. Some of them couldn't unsee it. The aunt who'd texted me to make it easy on everyone called a week later and said, simply, "I didn't know she'd been saying those things. I'm sorry I sent that text." That was all. It was enough. A name or two left the group chat. Others closed ranks around my mother, because loyalty is easier than looking straight at something true, and some people would rather defend a lie they're comfortable with than sit with a fact that costs them. That's how it really goes. Not everyone turns on the person who is wrong. Some go quiet, some dig in, and you learn, finally, who is who. My mother stopped calling me. For a woman who'd called 2 or 3 times a week my entire life, always needing, always collecting, the silence was its own kind of message, and I let it be one. One evening, a text came through from Chelsea. Just one line. "You could have just helped me." I sat with that for a long time, because there was a version of me that would have folded at those 7 words. The old me, the water, the one who always found a way to pay so the family wouldn't fracture. And it stung, because underneath everything, she was still my sister, and I still loved her in the complicated, worn way you love someone who has hurt you with the same hands they once held yours with. But I had learned, that Sunday, the difference between helping someone land and handing them the runway again. So I did something that surprised even me. I paid 1 month's rent on her new place. 1 month. I sent it without a note. And then I turned off the notification so I wouldn't sit there watching for a thank you that I already suspected wouldn't come. My thumb hovered over the send button for a second, the old reflex fighting the new boundary, and then I let it go. And then I texted her, once. "I'll help you land," I wrote. "I won't hand you the runway again." She read it. I watched the little word "read" appear beneath the message. She didn't answer. Not a thank you, not an argument, nothing. And I understood that the silence was the answer, that a person who has used you as a resource doesn't always want your help. Sometimes what they want is your surrender. And those two things wear the same face but are not the same thing at all. It would have been easy to let all of it harden into a story about how people are cruel and you can't trust anyone. But something kept me from that, and it walked up to my door a few days later without calling ahead. Aunt Ruth came by with a casserole wrapped in a checkered towel, still warm, and she didn't ask a single question about the house. Not about my mother, not about Chelsea, not about what came next. She looked at me, really looked at me, standing there in my doorway holding my daughter, and she asked, "Have you eaten today?" No one had asked me that in a year, maybe longer. My aunt stood on my step and asked if I'd eaten, and I couldn't answer for a moment because my throat closed around the question. She came in and took Avery from my arms so I could sit down, settling the baby on her hip like she'd done it 1,000 times, and she put the warm dish in front of me and found me a fork. And she held my daughter while I ate the first hot meal I'd eaten, sitting down in months. She didn't want anything. She wasn't building toward an ask. She was just there, the way my father used to be there with his small, sorry looks. Except Ruth had turned the look into a warm dish and a pair of hands that reached for my child instead of my wallet. Before she left, she stood at the door and said the thing I'd been avoiding all week. "Your dad left you that letter for a reason, Laura," she said. "You've been carrying it around unopened for 2 years. It might be time." So that night, after Avery was asleep, I opened the drawer and I took out the envelope with my father's handwriting on it, and I finally broke the seal. His writing was exactly as I remembered, slanting a little more toward the bottom of the page, the way it always did when his hand grew tired. He'd written it in 2023, in the last months, when he must have known his time was short. He wrote that he had watched, his whole life, the way the family had made me into the strong one, and that he was sorry. "Being the strong one was never a gift I meant to give you," he wrote. "I'm sorry I let them make it your job. I told myself you were fine because it was easier than making it right. That was my failure, not your strength." There was a faint brown tea stain in the corner of the page, the ghost of a cup gone cold beside him, and I could see him at the kitchen table so clearly that it hurt to breathe. And then he wrote the part that reached back through the years and rearranged everything I thought I knew about myself. He told me that a good part of the down payment on my house, the $310,000 I'd been so proud of, so certain was proof that I didn't need anyone, had come from him. A last gift, given quietly, moved into an account he'd helped me set up, folded in among my own savings so that I'd never be able to point to it and refuse it out of pride. He knew I would never take help if he made a thing of it, so he made no thing of it. He just made sure that when I stood at the closing table and signed for my house, a piece of my father was in the ground I'd be standing on. And he told me why. "Keep one door in this world that only opens for you," he wrote. "I helped you buy it. Whatever happens, whoever asks, don't ever give it away. You've spent your life being everyone's open door. This one is yours to lock." He knew. Somehow, before any of this, before the divorce, before the truck, before my mother's good coat on my front path, my father had known that a day would come when the family would try to take my house from me, and he had done what he could, from the far side of his own death, to make sure that when it came, the ground would be mine to stand on and mine to lock. I sat with the letter in my lap, and I cried. Finally. And it wasn't the kind of crying you do when someone hurts you. It was the kind you do when you find out too late to say thank you, that someone had been loving you quietly the whole time you thought you were carrying everything alone. I looked around the living room I had fought to keep, the room where I'd stood in the doorway with Avery and told my mother the truth, and I understood the house differently than I ever had. It wasn't only something I'd earned, it was something I'd been given, by the one person who'd never once asked me to be strong so that he wouldn't have to worry. I folded the letter along its worn creases and set it on the shelf beside a photograph of him, where I would see it every single day. If this reached something in you, I hope you'll share the moment you finally set a boundary with someone you still loved. Somebody scrolling tonight needs to hear that they're allowed to choose themselves too. A few months went by, and my life got smaller in the ways that don't matter, and bigger in the ways that do. I repainted the nursery a soft blue one Saturday, with the windows open and the smell of fresh paint drifting through the house, and Avery on a blanket on the floor, watching me and gnawing on a teething ring and starting, just barely, to figure out how to crawl. She'd scoot a few inches across the wood floor toward the paint tray, and I'd move it, and she'd change course and come at it from another angle, stubborn and delighted, and we'd both laugh in our different ways. She has my father's eyes. I didn't notice it until I read his letter, and now I can't stop seeing him in her face. I expanded the practice, too. Took on another hygienist, added a second cosmetic chair, and put a new line on the sign out front that simply said, "By appointment." A small thing, but it meant I finally had the kind of days where I got to decide who came in and when. And after a lifetime of my time and my resources belonging to whoever reached for them first, that line on a sign felt like a whole new way of living. I didn't win a war. That's not what any of this was. I just stopped volunteering to lose one. There is a difference. And it took me 34 years and a moving truck idling in my own driveway to feel that difference land in my body instead of just understanding it in my head. My mother's name came up on my phone one evening, the first time in months. Just the word "Mom," lighting the screen the way it had that night at 2 in the morning when all of this began. I looked at it for a long moment. I thought about the good coat, and the empty truck rolling back down Birchwood Lane, and her voice coming out of the speaker in my own front yard. I thought about my father's letter on the shelf, and the door he'd bought me, and what he'd asked me to do with it. Then I set the phone face down on the table, and I let it go to voicemail. I don't hate my mother. I want to be clear about that, because it would be simpler if I did, and it wouldn't be true. I still love her, in the tired, complicated way you love someone who shaped you and wounded you with the same hands. A few days later, I sent her a short text, calm, with no accusation in it. Just a line wishing her well and telling her I hoped she was taking care of herself. A boundary doesn't have to be cruel to be a boundary. I keep the door of my kindness open. I just don't leave the door of my house unlocked anymore. Those are two different doors, and it took me my whole life to learn that they were. That evening, I carried Avery out onto the porch to watch the last of the light go down over Birchwood Lane. She's getting heavier every week, solid and real against my hip, and she smells like the lavender soap I use for her bath, and she reached up and grabbed a fistful of my hair and held on the way. She holds on to everything, with her whole small strength. We sat on the step together for a while, the two of us, in the quiet of a house that belongs to us and to no one else. Then I stood, and I took my own key out of my pocket. My key, the one the locksmith had handed me in a small envelope with the words, "Nobody's getting in with an old one," and I locked my own door behind me. And I carried my daughter inside to put her to bed in the one house in the world that only opens for us.